Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we've got a game between two of the best players in the world. Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces. Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa has black. This was at the FTX Crypto Cup. This is a rapid game played at 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. And for those who have requested it, yes, I finally have the names of the players permanently on the screen during the video. Hey, listen, I'm old. Your technology frightens me, but I got it done. Let's jump right into the game. Alireza Firouzja has white. He plays e4. Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa has black, c5. Knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. The Rossolimo system, usually used to avoid the Sveshnikov defense. And Pragg plays g6, allowing Firouzja, if he wants to double his pawns on c6, which he does do. So he takes, and black takes towards the center of the board with his pawn. So this gives black the two bishops, but white gets a lead in development. He's now castled and he has a knight developed, and black has nothing developed so far. Bishop to g7, rook to e1. So what Firouzja wants to do, he wants to take this pawn and play it to e5 and gain some space and make it hard for black to liberate his position. Queen to c7, you can see Pragg is also aiming at this e5 square. d3, that allows Alireza to free his c1 bishop. And now e5. Now that permanently blocks white from playing e5, as long as black's pawn is there. But it locks up the position, which may favor the knights a little bit versus the bishops. We'll see. But Alireza says, I'm going to open up the position right now. He's saying, well, black's king is still in the center of the board, so I'm going to take advantage of my lead in development and open up the position for that reason. Knight f6, d4, pawn takes, queen takes, castles, and knight to c3. So what a white wants to do, ideally, would be to play e5, then maneuver the c3 knight to e4 and d6. Black would have to be rather cooperative to allow that to happen, but in a perfect world, that is what white would like to do. So Pragg says, okay, let's just stop that right now, and plays queen to b6. He offers the trade of queens. And yes, white could go ahead and play e5 here, but after queen takes, knight e4, rook e8, pins the pawn against the rook at e1, say h3. This is just an equal game. And black has less space, but he can play c5, bishop to b7, get some active pieces. So Alireza says, okay, I'll take queens off the board. I still believe in my position. Now, white has space, but black still has the two bishops in an endgame. e5 is played. Now, Pragg has a few choices here. He can play the knight to d5, but that's a bad choice, because then after knight takes, he has these incredibly weak pawns. All three of these pawns went from healthy to weak. Knight to g4 is another option, but then h3 kicks the knight to h6, and then bishop to g5, and this knight has nowhere to go. If it goes to f5, g4, and it has to go back to h6, so this is a bad position. So what black does is he plays the knight to e8, and at the very least it helps to control this d6 square. Bishop to e3, white aims at the b6 pawn, and black defends with the rook. You'd think the more natural move would be b5. The problem with that is it weakens the dark square severely, and after bishop to c5, Alireza would already be winning material. So to keep that c5 square protected, Pragg plays the rook to a6, and rook a to d1, centralizing all of the pieces, and now f6. Black has to do something about this e5 pawn. It's very annoying. It really keeps him from doing what he wants to do. Alireza plays bishop to f4. He doesn't take on black's terms. Pawn takes, bishop takes. So now he's aiming at this bishop on g7, and black plays d5. And this could be a very dangerous pawn. It's a pawn in the middle of the board. It is completely passed, and it could cause a lot of trouble. One downside, though, is bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, and now that two bishop advantage is gone. So this pawn structure is really key to the future of black's position. It has a lot of potential strength, but it's also awkward and easily attacked. So the question is, can black advance it and keep those pawns from being captured? Knight to e5, immediately attacking the c6 pawn. The bishop goes to b7, and now a3. The knight at c3 couldn't move because the a2 pawn would fall to the rook. So by playing a3, now this knight on c3 can move knight to f5 to help support the pawn advance to d4, h3, and now d4. The knight goes to e4. So the pawn structure for black is advancing, but these two knights could cause a lot of problems for black. And you look at the two kings, right? Prague's king is a lot more vulnerable. Firouzja's king is very safe. That could be an issue going forward. c5, and although this bishop is nice, he would not mind at all just taking off that knight. That removes all of Firouzja's counterplay. So Firouzja, he wanted to keep that knight on the board, plays knight to g5, and that has a fairly nasty threat. He's threatening to play knight to d7, which hits the rook. And the rook would have no square. And when that rook moves, then the h7 pawn would fall, basically. So knight to d7 is a serious threat. So black plays bishop to c8 to keep that knight from going to d7, but now rook to c1. What Alireza wants to do is attack this pawn structure. He wants to play b4, create a weakness, and capture on c5. The rook goes to a7, but now b4, attacking that pawn structure. Now he gives up his a3 pawn, but then pawn takes pawn. Now in this position, if Prague just takes back, then after rook c5, rook c3, it's still a fairly equal endgame in this position. But instead, he plays the move d3. Now this is scary for white. He's threatening to play d2, which forks these two rooks and would just basically win the game on the spot. So Alireza has to do something about that, and he plays the rook at c1 to d1. Now pawn takes, but the knight can take the pawn at d3. Now that restores material equality, and basically everything for Prague is wrapped up in this c5 pawn. If this pawn can successfully advance, then he's in good shape. Otherwise, his weaker king could become a big issue. So he plays c4 with tempo, hitting the knight. The knight moves to e5, c3, and now rook to d5. Alireza wants to move his rook behind the passed pawn, rook to c5, and attack from behind. c2, rook to c5. Now knight to d4 protects the pawn from the rook that is attacking it, and rook to c7, rook on the 7th. Now the best move for black here is rook to b3, with the threat of the rook going to b1. Another advantage of this is if Firouzja tries to generate counterplay against the king by playing the knight to g4, then the bishop at c8 can just chop it off. But Prague does not play that. He plays the move bishop to a6, which not only doesn't threaten to advance the pawn with rook to b1, he's no longer defending this g4 square. And Firouzja, seeing that, jumps right into that square. Now he's threatening mate in 2. With knight to h6 check, the king would be forced to h8, and rook to h7 would just be checkmate. So it's a very serious threat, and black has to address it. He plays knight to f5 to keep the knight out of h6. Unfortunately, that removes the defender of the c2 pawn, and Firouzja can take that pawn now. And he's gotten rid of black's greatest threat, and all that black is left with is he's a pawn down with a less safe king. So Prague is now in full defense mode against Firouzja's attack. Rook to b3 to bring the rook back for defensive purposes. Rook to c6, gaining a tempo against the bishop. Bishop to b5. And now here begins a really cool combination. Knight to f6 check. King to h8. And now, instead of moving his rook, he plays knight f takes h7. He counterattacks black's rook. So black takes white's rook, white takes black's rook, but now, because he took the pawn at h7, white is up 2 pawns, and that is big trouble. King to g7, knight f e6 check. Now here the king can go to f6, but then knight h7 check, and with king goes to f7, knight to d8, forks the king and the bishop, bringing white closer to victory. I mean, black can always counterattack this knight, but losing that bishop would be a critical problem for black. So he plays the king to h6 instead, but after knight f7 check, king h7, knight to e5, and in this position, with 2 healthy pawns, threats against a weak king, and currently attacking the bishop at c6, Praggnanandhaa resigned, and Alireza Firouzja won. Now, even though after going over this great game from Alireza, there is still some great chess that you are missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is this game right here. Check it out for another great game from Alireza Firouzja.